The morning fog rolled in thick across Van Nuys private airport, wrapping the luxury jets in a ghostly embrace. The new pilot had just transferred from a commercial airline last week, and he was determined to prove himself at this high-end facility where celebrities and business moguls were regular clients. He stood by the sleek Gulfstream G650, going through his pre-flight checklist with meticulous attention. The sound of approaching footsteps caught his attention, and through the misty morning air, he spotted a group of people heading toward his assigned aircraft. The pilot squinted, trying to make out their faces and credentials in the hazy light. Leading the group was a tall, lean figure with distinctive braids, dressed in what looked like designer clothes from head to toe. The way the group carried themselves suggested they were used to moving freely around private airports, but something didn't sit right with the pilot. He hadn't received any passenger manifests yet, and protocol demanded proper documentation for everyone boarding the aircraft. Years of military training and commercial aviation experience had taught him one thing: never compromise on security, no matter who the passenger might be. He straightened his uniform and walked toward the approaching group, clipboard in hand. The rest of the ground crew seemed to be watching the scene unfold with unusual interest, but he was too focused on following proper procedure to notice their knowing looks. "Good morning," he called out, positioning himself between the group and the aircraft's stairs. "I'll need to see some identification and boarding documentation before anyone can board this aircraft." His voice was firm but professional, carrying across the misty morning air. The group exchanged glances, and a few chuckles rippled through them. The tall figure in front raised an eyebrow, his gold chains glinting in the early morning light. One of his companions stepped forward, looking slightly amused. "Do you know who this is?" he asked, gesturing toward the tall man. The pilot stood his ground. In his mind, it didn't matter if this was the President of the United States. Proper documentation was non-negotiable. "Sir, I understand you may be a regular client, but I need to verify everyone's credentials before allowing access to the aircraft. It's standard security protocol." More members of the airport staff had gathered nearby, some whispering among themselves, others trying to hide their grins. The fog was starting to lift, and in the clearing morning light, the pilot began to notice more details about the man standing before him: the distinctive braids, the laid-back stance, the unmistakable aura of someone who was used to being recognized everywhere they went. The tall man's expression was unreadable for a moment, and tension hung in the air like the lingering wisps of morning fog. The pilot's heart was racing, but his face remained composed. He'd dealt with unhappy passengers before, and he wasn't about to back down from doing his job properly. Little did he know, this moment of steadfast professionalism was about to turn into one of the most memorable encounters of his career, and the beginning of an unlikely friendship that would challenge everything he thought he knew about first impressions. The standoff at the foot of the luxury jet was starting to draw more attention. Airport staff members were now openly gathering around, their phones discreetly held at their sides. The pilot couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something obvious, but his professional instincts kept him firmly rooted in place. "Look here," said one of the group members, stepping forward with an air of slight frustration. "This is Snoop Dogg's private jet. We fly out of here all the time." He gestured toward the tall figure, who was now leaning casually against his designer luggage, watching the scene unfold with what appeared to be growing amusement. The pilot took a deep breath. "I understand that, sir, but without proper documentation, I cannot allow anyone to board this aircraft. It's a matter of security and protocol." His voice remained steady, though his heart was hammering in his chest. Around him, he could hear muffled laughter and whispered conversations. A younger member of the group pulled out his phone, presumably to call someone who could sort out this situation. The morning sun had now broken through the fog, illuminating the sleek private jet behind them. The pilot noticed more details about the group: their relaxed demeanor, the expensive watches, the professional camera equipment some of them carried. Everything screamed celebrity entourage, but he couldn't shake his commitment to proper procedure. Man, this is a first. The tall figure finally spoke, his voice carrying that distinctive laid-back drawl that should have been immediately recognizable. He adjusted his designer sunglasses and gave a slight head shake. Usually, people be trying to let us on planes we ain't supposed to be on, not the other way around. The comment drew laughs from the growing crowd of onlookers. The pilot felt his ears growing hot, but he maintained his professional demeanor. He'd learned early in his career that treating everyone equally was the mark of true professionalism, regardless of their status. "I apologize for any inconvenience," the pilot said, clipboard still firmly in hand, "but I need to see proper credentials and flight documentation. Once those are verified, we can proceed with boarding." He tried to ignore the fact that nearly everyone at the private terminal was now watching the scene unfold. One of the airport's senior staff members was hurrying across the tarmac, papers in hand, looking both concerned and slightly amused. The morning breeze carried snippets of conversation from the onlookers. "Can't believe he doesn't recognize. This is going to go viral. Wait till he finds out." The tall figure's entourage was now split between those who looked annoyed and those who seemed to find the whole situation hilarious. Through it all, the man himself remained surprisingly calm, occasionally exchanging glances with his team that suggested this might be one of the more interesting starts to a morning he'd had in a while. The pilot stood his ground, even as doubt started to creep in. Something about the way everyone else was acting suggested he might be in the middle of a situation that was bigger than he realized. Still, he remembered his instructor's words from years ago. It's better to be embarrassed for doing your job right than praised for doing it wrong. Little did he know, the next few minutes would turn this seemingly awkward confrontation into a story that would be shared across social media platforms and news outlets for weeks to come. All because he chose to stick to his principles in the face of celebrity status. The moment of revelation arrived with the hurried footsteps of Snoop's manager, who came rushing across the tarmac with a folder full of documents. The morning sun now fully illuminated the scene, and beads of sweat had started forming on the pilot's forehead. Something about the way everyone was looking at him made his stomach do small flips. "Here's all the documentation," the manager said, slightly out of breath, "including the aircraft registration, flight plan, and crew assignments." He handed over the papers, then added with a hint of amusement, "You might want to check the pilot assignment sheet first." The pilot's eyes scanned the documents, and his heart nearly stopped. There it was, in clear black and white. He had been specifically requested as Snoop Dogg's pilot for the next 6 months. This wasn't just any private jet he was protecting. It was the very aircraft he was supposed to fly, and the man he'd been stopping from boarding was none other than the owner himself. The realization hit him like a wave of cold water. His face must have shown it too, because several people around him couldn't hold back their laughter anymore. He looked up at the tall figure, now unmistakably recognizable as the legendary Snoop Dogg, and felt his professional demeanor crack slightly. I apologize, sir," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't." The documents trembled slightly in his hands as the full weight of the situation sank in. His first week on the job, and he'd managed to stop one of the world's most famous rappers from boarding his own private jet. But what happened next would change the entire mood of the morning. Instead of showing anger or annoyance, Snoop Dogg threw his head back and let out his characteristic laugh. "Yo, this is too good," he said, his gold chains catching the sunlight. "First time in history, someone stopped me from getting on my own plane." The tension in the air dissolved instantly. The gathered crowd, who had been holding their breath waiting for the pilot's reaction, joined in the laughter. Even the pilot, despite his embarrassment, couldn't help but crack a smile. "Hey, check this out," Snoop continued, addressing his entourage, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "This man right here, he didn't care if I was the president himself. He was gonna make sure everything was right." He stepped forward and extended his hand to the pilot. "That's the kind of person I want flying my plane." The pilot's relief was visible as he shook Snoop's hand. The rapper's genuine appreciation for his dedication to protocol turned what could have been a career-damaging mistake into something entirely different. The airport staff watching the scene unfold had their phones out now, no longer trying to be discreet about capturing the moment. Most people see the chains and the fame and just wave us through, Snoop continued, now speaking directly to the pilot. But you stuck to your guns. That's respect right there. His words carried a weight that made the pilot stand a little straighter, his embarrassment gradually being replaced by pride. The morning's awkward confrontation had transformed into something unexpected. A moment of mutual respect between two professionals from very different worlds. As the pilot helped organize the boarding process, now fully aware of who his passengers were, he could hear Snoop telling the story to someone on his phone, laughing about how he'd finally found a pilot who took security seriously enough to stop him from boarding his own plane. This was just the beginning of what would become an extraordinary day, as news of the incident began spreading through social media, painting a picture of professionalism, humility, and the unexpected ways that doing the right thing can lead to the most surprising outcomes. The next hour at the private airport turned into something nobody had expected. Instead of rushing to board the plane, Snoop decided to turn the morning's incident into an impromptu meet and greet. The crew gathered around as he pulled up a chair on the tarmac, his easygoing personality making everyone feel comfortable despite his superstar status. "Y'all won't believe what just went down," he said to his phone camera, live streaming to his millions of followers. "Got stopped from getting on my own plane." He turned the camera toward the pilot, who was now checking the final preparations for takeoff. "But check this out. That's exactly the kind of security we need. No shortcuts, no special treatment." The pilot tried to focus on his pre-flight checklist, but he couldn't help overhearing the conversations around him. Airport staff who had witnessed the whole scene were sharing their versions of the story, each adding their own perspective on how the morning's events had unfolded. Someone mentioned that videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. "Hey, pilot," Snoop called out, waving him over. "Come tell these folks what was going through your mind." The pilot hesitated for a moment, but Snoop's genuine warmth made him feel at ease. Walking over, he found himself surrounded by the entire entourage, all eyes on him. "I was just doing my job," he said simply, adjusting his uniform cap. "In aviation, you can't take shortcuts with security, no matter who's boarding the plane." His voice grew more confident as he spoke about something he knew well. One small oversight can lead to big problems later. Snoop nodded approvingly. "See, that's what I'm talking about. This man right here got principles." He turned to his crew. "Remember when we had that pilot last year who didn't even check if the fuel tank was full? Nearly had us making an emergency landing in Denver." The conversation shifted to sharing stories about travel experiences, with both good and bad pilots they'd encountered. The pilot found himself relaxing as he listened to Snoop's tales from his years of touring, each story told with that distinctive laid-back style that had made him famous. One of the ground crew brought over coffee for everyone, and what should have been a tense situation had transformed into something that felt more like a friendly gathering. Snoop's security team, who had initially seemed annoyed by the delay, were now laughing along with everyone else. "You know what's crazy?" Snoop said, checking his phone. "This story's already blowing up online. But check out the comments. Everyone's saying the same thing. They're glad to see someone doing their job right, not letting fame get in the way of safety." The pilot glanced at his watch, knowing they needed to stick to their flight schedule. Almost reading his mind, Snoop stood up and stretched. "All right, y'all, we got a schedule to keep. Can't be late for Vegas." He turned to the pilot with a grin. "Now that we got all the paperwork straight, think you can get us there on time?" As the group finally began boarding the aircraft, the pilot couldn't help but reflect on how differently this could have turned out. Instead of being angry about being stopped, Snoop had turned the whole incident into a positive moment, showing everyone that true professionalism goes both ways. The morning sun now high in the sky, the pilot climbed into the cockpit, feeling more confident than ever. Through the cabin door, he could hear Snoop telling another story, his distinctive laugh echoing through the aircraft. This was surely going to be one of the most memorable flights of his career, and it hadn't even taken off yet. The luxury jet cruised smoothly at 40,000 feet, cutting through the clear blue sky on its way to Las Vegas. What started as a tense morning had evolved into something completely unexpected. About an hour into the flight, the pilot heard a gentle knock on the cockpit door. His co-pilot gave him a knowing smile as Snoop himself stepped into the small space. "Mind if I hang out here for a bit?" Snoop asked, ducking his tall frame to fit through the doorway. "Always wanted to see how this thing really works." He settled into the jump seat behind the pilots, his eyes taking in the array of instruments and controls with genuine curiosity. The pilot began explaining some of the basic flight instruments, surprised by Snoop's genuine interest. "Man, this is like a video game. But for real?" Snoop commented, leaning forward to get a better look at the navigation display. "And you learned all this in the military?" "Yeah," the pilot replied, feeling more comfortable now. "Flew transport planes for 8 years before moving to commercial aviation." He glanced back at Snoop. "Actually, military flights taught me why security protocols are so important. One small mistake can change everything." Snoop nodded thoughtfully. "You know, I've had all kinds of experiences with security over the years," he shared, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Some folks profile you, some treat you different because of who you are, good and bad. But what you did this morning, that was real. Equal treatment, no exceptions." The co-pilot chimed in about a close call they'd had once due to rushed security checks, and soon the three were swapping stories. Snoop talked about his early days of touring, flying on budget airlines before he could afford private jets. The pilot shared experiences from his military days, including some lighter moments that had everyone laughing. "You wouldn't believe some of the things I've seen," Snoop said, shaking his head. "Had one pilot try to take selfies during takeoff. Another one wanted to smoke with me instead of flying the plane." He laughed at the memory. "That's why I respect what you did today. Safety first, fame second." Through the cockpit windows, they could see the landscape changing below, desert replacing the California coastline. Snoop pulled out his phone and started recording. "Live from the cockpit, y'all," he announced to his followers. "With the pilot who wouldn't let me on my own plane. Now he's teaching me how to fly this thing." The pilot couldn't help but smile. Just hours ago, he'd been worried about losing his job. Now here he was, giving an impromptu flying lesson to one of the most famous rappers in the world. The whole situation felt surreal. "Check this out," Snoop continued on his live stream. "My man here got more medals than a general. Been flying everything from military cargo to commercial jets. Now he's making sure your boy Snoop gets to Vegas safe and sound." As they approached Las Vegas, the city's distinctive skyline appearing on the horizon, Snoop turned serious again. "You know what? I'm gonna request you for all my flights from now on. Need more people like you in this world, doing the right thing no matter what." The pilot felt a sense of pride he hadn't experienced in years. What could have been the worst day of his career had turned into one of the best. As he began the descent into Las Vegas, he realized this flight had taught him something valuable too. Sometimes standing your ground, even when it seems like a mistake, can lead to the most unexpected and rewarding outcomes. By the time the private jet touched down in Las Vegas, the morning's events had taken on a life of their own across social media. One of the ground crew's videos had gone viral, showing the moment when the pilot stood his ground, not realizing he was stopping Snoop Dogg from boarding his own plane. But it was Snoop's reaction that really caught people's attention. News outlets were picking up the story, with headlines like, "Pilot stops Snoop from boarding his own jet. What happened next will surprise you," and "Snoop Dogg praises pilot who didn't recognize him." The comment sections were filled with people sharing their own stories about standing up for what's right, even when it's uncomfortable. "Yo, check this out," Snoop said as they walked through the private terminal, showing the pilot his phone. The video of their cockpit conversation had already racked up millions of views. People were calling it a masterclass in handling awkward situations with grace. Some comments praised Snoop's humility, while others applauded the pilot's dedication to safety. The pilot's phone hadn't stopped buzzing since they landed. His old military buddies were sending him messages, having recognized him in the videos. "Only you would stop Snoop Dogg from getting on his own plane," one texted, "and somehow end up giving him a flying lesson." Even aviation forums were discussing the incident, with pilots from around the world chiming in on the importance of following security protocols, regardless of who the passenger might be. The story was becoming a talking point about professionalism in the aviation industry. Local news crews were waiting outside the Las Vegas terminal, hoping to catch an interview. Snoop's security team started to move them toward the exit, but Snoop had other ideas. "Hold up," he said, turning to the pilot. "They gonna tell this story anyway. Might as well tell it right. You cool with doing an interview?" The pilot hesitated for a moment, but agreed. Standing there under the bright Nevada sun, they recounted the morning's events together. Snoop did most of the talking, making the pilot laugh with his animated retelling of how confused everyone was. "Man, the look on his face when he realized who I was." Snoop chuckled. "But that's what I love about it. He didn't care who I was. Safety first, everything else second." The interview quickly went viral too, with people praising both men for turning what could have been an embarrassing moment into a lesson about respect and professionalism. Aviation schools started using the story as an example in their training materials, showing how following protocols isn't just about rules, it's about integrity. Social media influencers were recreating the scene, adding their own spin to it. Memes started popping up everywhere. "When you're so good at your job, you stop your boss from entering his own building." Fan art appeared, showing cartoon versions of the pilot and Snoop in various silly situations. But what touched the pilot most were the messages from young people saying they were inspired to pursue careers in aviation after seeing his story. "If he can stand up to Snoop Dogg, I can stand up for what's right too," one young aspiring pilot posted. Back at the hotel, scrolling through the countless reactions to their story, the pilot couldn't help but smile. Just that morning, he'd been worried about losing his job. Now, he was being celebrated for doing it right. Snoop had turned what could have been a career-ending mistake into a powerful message about staying true to your principles. As he prepared for the return flight the next day, his phone pinged with a message from his old flight instructor. "Saw the video. This is exactly what I meant when I said, no exceptions when it comes to safety. Proud of you, kid." Sometimes, the pilot realized, the biggest test of your principles comes when you least expect it. Over the next few months, what started as an awkward encounter turned into an unexpected partnership. The pilot became Snoop's go-to choice for all his flights, and their story continued to inspire people around the world. Every time they flew together, they added new chapters to their unlikely friendship. During one flight to New York, Snoop brought up something that had been on his mind. "You know what's crazy?" he said, settling into the cockpit's jump seat as he often did during their flights. "Before all this happened, I used to think all these security checks were just people giving me a hard time. Now I get why they matter." The pilot nodded, adjusting the altitude as they cruised over the Midwest. "It's funny how things work out," he replied. "My colleagues thought I was crazy for stopping you that day. Now they're all extra careful with their security checks, no matter who's flying." Word had spread through the private aviation community about their story. Other pilots would come up to them at airports, sharing their own experiences about times they had to make tough calls. Some admitted they might have bent the rules for a celebrity, but this story had changed their perspective. During a stopover in Chicago, a young airport worker approached them nervously. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said. "Last week, I had to stop a CEO from boarding because his ID was expired. Everyone was pressuring me to let it slide, but I remembered your story and stood my ground." Snoop's tour schedule was packed that summer, which meant lots of flights across the country. The pilot found himself becoming part of Snoop's inner circle, trusted not just for his flying skills, but for his unwavering professionalism. During these flights, they talked about everything from music to life lessons. "Man, you should see some of the messages I get," Snoop said during one flight, scrolling through his phone. "People telling me how this whole thing made them think differently about doing the right thing, even when it's hard." He showed the pilot a message from a teacher who had used their story to teach her students about integrity. The pilot had his own collection of messages. Young aviation students would write to him, asking for advice about handling difficult situations. "Just remember," he would tell them, "it's not about who's boarding your plane. It's about making sure everyone gets to their destination safely." During a flight to Miami, Snoop surprised everyone by bringing a film crew aboard. "We're making a documentary about breaking down stereotypes," he explained. "And this right here, this is the perfect example. Two people from completely different worlds, showing how respect goes both ways." The cameras captured their easy interaction, the way they had developed their own communication style in the cockpit. Snoop would ask questions about the flight instruments, genuinely curious about how everything worked. The pilot would explain things in simple terms, occasionally throwing in aviation jokes that now had Snoop laughing. "You see this right here?" Snoop would say to the camera, pointing at the pilot. "This is what integrity looks like. Not about fame, not about money, just about doing what's right." The pilot would smile, still somewhat amazed at how that one morning had changed everything. As summer turned to fall, their flights together became known for something else too. Snoop would often use the plane's speaker system to freestyle rap about aviation safety, making the pre-flight instructions the most entertaining part of the journey. The pilot would shake his head and laugh, but he had to admit, people definitely paid attention to the safety briefing now. Looking back, both of them agreed that sometimes the best partnerships come from the most unexpected situations. What could have been a career-ending mistake had turned into a friendship that was changing how people thought about professionalism, respect, and the importance of doing the right thing, no matter who's watching. 1 year after the famous morning incident, the private airport was buzzing with excitement. The pilot was about to be promoted to Chief of Security, a position created specifically to improve safety protocols across all private flights. The ceremony was supposed to be a small affair, but it turned into something much bigger. Nobody expected Snoop Dogg to show up. He had a concert in Houston that night, but he rearranged his entire schedule to be there. Walking into the airport terminal, dressed in his signature style, he brought along a surprise that left everyone speechless. "Check this out," Snoop announced to the gathered crowd, unveiling a large framed photo. It showed that famous moment from a year ago. The pilot standing firm at the aircraft stairs, not knowing he was stopping Snoop from boarding his own plane. Below the photo was a simple inscription. "Sometimes doing the right thing means standing your ground, even when you're standing alone." The photo would hang in the airport's main terminal, serving as a daily reminder to every pilot and crew member about the importance of following safety protocols. But Snoop wasn't done with the surprises just yet. "Y'all know how this story started," he said, addressing the crowd of airport staff, pilots, and media. "But let me tell you what happened after. This man right here." He pointed to the pilot. "He taught me something about respect. Not the kind you get from being famous, but the kind you earn by doing what's right." The pilot stood there in his crisp uniform, thinking about how much had changed in just 1 year. That morning could have gone so many different ways. One angry reaction from Snoop, one moment of backing down from his principles, and none of this would have happened. "But here's the real story," Snoop continued, pulling out a tablet. "We got messages from all over the world. Kids writing about standing up to peer pressure. Flight crews sharing stories about times they chose safety over convenience. Even got one from a pilot in Australia who stopped a plane from taking off in bad weather, even when everyone was pushing him to fly. The crowd listened intently as Snoop shared more stories. A young security officer who prevented a rush boarding process during a storm. A ground crew member who insisted on proper de-icing despite pressure to hurry up. All of them mentioned being inspired by what happened that foggy morning. So today, Snoop announced, we're not just celebrating a promotion. We're celebrating what happens when people choose to do what's right, even when it's not easy. He turned to the pilot. And my man, you showed everyone how it's done. The pilot's acceptance speech was short but meaningful. A year ago, I was just doing my job, he said. I didn't know I was stopping Snoop Dogg from boarding his own plane. But that's exactly the point. It shouldn't matter who's trying to board. Safety comes first, no exceptions. After the ceremony, as people gathered for refreshments, Snoop pulled the pilot aside. Got something else for you, he said, handing him an envelope. Inside was an invitation to help develop a new training program for private aviation security, combining the pilot's military experience with real-world scenarios like their famous encounter. See, that's the thing about doing the right thing, Snoop said, watching people take photos with a newly hung picture. You never know how far those ripples gonna spread. One moment of standing your ground, and look what happened. You changed how people think about doing their job right. As the day wound down, the pilot looked at the framed photo one more time. That morning felt both like yesterday and a lifetime ago. What started as a potential career disaster had turned into something that was changing the private aviation industry, one flight at a time. Ready for your next flight? Snoop asked with a grin. Got a tour starting next week. Need my favorite pilot to make sure we keep doing things the right way. The pilot smiled and nodded. Sometimes the best endings are really just new beginnings in disguise.